John McKinnon wasn't looking for anything special that freezing February morning, just another day checking his fences in rural Wyoming until he heard the whimper. There, half buried in the snow, lay a golden retriever barely moving. Without hesitation, John scooped up the dog and carried it 2 miles back to his ranch house. He never expected anything in return. That's just what folks do out here. But the next morning, when a black limousine pulled up his dusty driveway and America's most reclusive billionaire stepped out with an offer of $10 million, John's simple act of kindness suddenly became the biggest decision of his life. What secret could this golden retriever possibly hold to be worth millions to its mysterious owner? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rising February sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered ranch house, its weathered sign, McKinnon Ranch Est 1952, barely visible in the dim light. At 4:30 sharp, John McKinnon's boots hit the wooden floor beside his bed, just as they had every morning for the past 30 years. The thermometer outside his window read -15, brutal even by Wyoming standards. In the kitchen, he pulled his father's leather-bound journal from its shelf while waiting for his coffee to brew. The pages had grown soft with age, dog-eared, from decades of reference. A ranch isn't just land, his father had written. It's a promise to the past and a debt to the future. John ran his calloused finger along the words, feeling their weight more heavily this morning. The journal's latest entry was his own, added just last night. Mortgage payment overdue, hay prices up again, 3 fence sections needing repair before the next storm. The numbers didn't add up, hadn't for a while now, but John had learned from his father that some things were worth more than money, like the satisfaction of watching the sun rise over land your family had worked for generations. He poured his coffee into the same chipped mug he'd been using since his father passed. Through the kitchen window, he could see the old barn where he'd learned to rope, the corrals where he'd broken his first horse, the ridge where his father had taught him to track injured cattle through spring snowstorms. Every inch of the 1,000-acre spread told a story, and every story was part of who he was. The radio crackled with the morning weather report, another storm system moving in, possibly the worst of the season. John pulled on his heavy coat, checked his emergency kit, and headed out to begin his morning checks. The cattle would need extra feed today, and those fence repairs couldn't wait. Not with a storm coming. His breath formed clouds in the freezing air as he walked the familiar path to the barn. Inside, the warmth of hay and horses welcomed him, along with the soft nickering of his mare, Shadow. "Morning, old girl," he murmured, reaching for her. Brush. The simple ritual of grooming helped him think, just as it had helped his father before him. Opening his battered notebook, John reviewed his plans for the day. The bank had left another message yesterday, polite but firm. 3 generations of McKinnons had weathered every storm Wyoming could throw at them, but this winter was testing even his stubborn resolve. Feed costs had doubled, cattle prices had dropped, and the small emergency fund he'd built up was nearly depleted. Shadow nudged his pocket, looking for treats. "Sorry, girl," he said softly. "We're all tightening our belts these days." He gave her an extra pat instead, remembering his father's words about hard times. "The measure of a rancher isn't in his wallet, son. It's in how he handles the lean years without losing his principles." The principles were still there, solid, as the mountains rising behind his land, but principles didn't pay bills or buy hay. John had started taking odd jobs for neighboring ranches, fixing equipment and helping with roundups. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Pride was another thing his father had taught him about, both the kind that keeps a man standing straight and the kind that can bring him down. As he led Shadow out into the pale morning light, his eyes caught on the empty paddocks where his own small herd used to graze. He'd sold most of them last fall, keeping just enough to maintain his grazing rights on the federal land. Each sale had felt like giving away a piece of his heritage, but he'd had no choice. The ranch had to survive. The wind was picking up now, carrying the bite of approaching snow. John mounted Shadow and began his morning patrol of the fence line. This was the part of ranching he loved best. Just him and his horse, watching the day come alive around them. Even in the depths of winter, there was a stark beauty to the Wyoming landscape that never failed to catch his breath. He'd covered about 2 miles when Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward. The mare stopped, alert to something John couldn't yet see or hear. Years of experience had taught him to trust his horse's instincts. He waited, scanning the snow-covered ground ahead. That's when he heard it, a sound that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. A whimper barely audible over the wind. Shadow shifted beneath him, ears still forward, sensing her rider's sudden tension. John dismounted, his boots crunching in the deep snow as he moved carefully toward the sound. The wind was picking up, throwing sheets of powder across his path, but he could just make out something dark against the white expanse ahead. At first, he thought it might be a coyote. They'd been coming closer to the ranch lately, driven by hunger and harsh weather. But as he drew nearer, his heart caught in his throat. Half buried in a drift lay a dog, its golden fur matted with ice. Only the shallow rise and fall of its chest showed it was still alive. "Easy now," John murmured, approaching slowly. The dog didn't move, didn't even lift its head. That was bad. He'd seen enough hypothermic animals to know when one was. Near the end, keeping his movements gentle, he knelt beside the creature, already shrugging off his heavy coat. That's when he saw it, a flash of something metallic beneath the ice-crusted fur. A collar, but like nothing he'd ever seen on a ranch dog. The metal looked like white gold, studded with what couldn't possibly be. But they were. Diamonds catching what little sunlight filtered through the storm clouds. "What in heaven's name are you doing out here, girl?" he whispered, carefully wrapping his coat around the dog's frozen body. The animal's only response was a faint whimper, but John felt a slight pressure against his hand. Trust, or maybe just desperation. The wind was really howling now, the promised storm arriving ahead of schedule. John's own body temperature was dropping rapidly without his coat, and the ranch house was a good 2 miles back. Shadow nickered nervously, sensing the changing weather. "No choice for it," John muttered. With utmost care, he gathered the dog into his arms. The animal was heavy, probably 80 pounds when healthy, but right now it felt like a burden. He'd been waiting his whole life to carry. Some things you did because they were easy, his father used to say, and some things you did because they were right. The trek back was a blur of stinging snow and burning muscles. Every few minutes, John would check the dog's breathing, terrified he'd feel it stop. The diamond-studded collar dug into his arm, a constant reminder that this was no ordinary stray. Somewhere out there, someone was probably searching desperately for this animal. Someone with the means to outfit their pet in jewelry worth more than his truck. But those were thoughts for later. Right now, his entire world had narrowed to the rhythm of his steps through deepening snow, the weight in his arms, and the increasingly urgent need to reach shelter. Shadow followed faithfully, occasionally pressing her warm nose against his back as if urging him forward. The last half-mile was the worst. His arms had gone numb, and the dog's weight seemed to have doubled. The freezing wind cut through his remaining layers like they were tissue paper, but giving up wasn't in John McKinnon's vocabulary, never had been, never would be. When the ranch house finally emerged from the swirling snow, John could have wept with relief. Shadow bumped past him to her stable, but he headed straight for the house. Later, he'd feel guilty about not taking care of his horse first. Another ranching rule broken, but right now, the barely breathing bundle in his arms took precedence. Inside, he gently laid the dog on the rug before the fireplace, his trembling hands already reaching for the emergency medical kit he kept for his livestock. As he began to warm and treat the animal, his mind wandered to that bizarre collar. What kind of dog wore diamonds? And more importantly, what series of events had led it to be dying in a snowdrift on his land? He had no way of knowing that by this time tomorrow, those questions would be answered in a way that would challenge everything he believed about fate, fortune, and the true value of a simple act of kindness. After getting the dog settled by the fire, John forced himself back out into the storm to tend to Shadow. He worked quickly, making sure she was warm and fed, his thoughts never far from the animal fighting for its life in his house. The old, veterinary first aid kit his father had assembled years ago waited on his kitchen counter, a collection of supplies that had saved more than a few animals over the decades. Back inside, John knelt beside the dog, his experienced hands moving with gentle efficiency. The animal's core temperature was dangerously low, but there was a quiet strength in its steady heartbeat. As he worked to warm it gradually, too much. Eat too quickly could be fatal. He found himself talking softly, the way his father had always done with injured animals. "You're a long way from home, aren't you, girl?" The dog's tail twitched slightly at the sound of his voice. Definitely a purebred golden retriever, and a fine one at that. Her coat, beneath the ice and mud, showed signs of expert grooming. The mysterious collar alone probably cost more than he made in a year. John cleaned and checked her paws for frostbite, watching her face for signs of pain. The dog's eyes stayed closed, but her breathing had grown stronger. That diamond-studded collar was starting to feel uncomfortably tight around her neck. After a moment's hesitation, he carefully unbuckled it, setting it aside on the coffee table where it gleamed incongruously against the worn wood. The storm raged outside, but inside the ranch house, time seemed to slow to the rhythm of the dog's breathing. John wrapped her in warm blankets, periodically checking her temperature and offering small amounts of water. His father's voice echoed. In his memory, animals know when someone truly cares. It gives them something to hold on to. As the evening deepened into night, John dozed in his armchair, waking every hour to check on his patient. Around midnight, he felt a gentle pressure against his hand. The dog's eyes were open, deep brown and surprisingly alert. She wasn't out of danger yet, but there was life in that gaze, and something else that caught him off guard. Intelligence, certainly, but also a kind of dignified gratitude that seemed almost human. "Well, look who's decided to join the land of the living," he said softly. The dog's tail wagged weakly, and she attempted to lift her head. "Easy now. You've had quite a day." He offered her more water, which she took carefully, her movements still shaky but purposeful. In the firelight, John studied her more closely. There was something unusual about this dog beyond her expensive collar. Her muscles, even in her weakened state, spoke of specialized training. The way she watched him, assessed him, this was no ordinary pet. He found himself wondering about her owner, someone wealthy enough for diamond collars, certainly, but what kind of person would let a dog like this end up alone in a blizzard? The nearest estates were miles away, and he hadn't heard of any missing dogs in the area, though with the storms lately, news traveled slowly. The dog shifted slightly, resting her head against his knee. The gesture felt like trust freely given, and something in John's chest tightened. He'd always been good with animals, had to be in his line of work, but this felt different, special, somehow. "You can stay here as long as you need," he told her, scratching gently behind her ears, "though something tells me someone's looking for you pretty hard right about now." The dog's eyes drifted closed, but her tail thumped softly against the floor, once, twice, 3 times. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and driving snow against the glass. But inside, in the warm circle of firelight, John McKinnon kept his vigil. Whatever tomorrow might bring, whatever mysteries this dog might represent, right now there was just this, the quiet companionship of 2 souls waiting out the storm together. He had no idea that in less than 12 hours, a black limousine would wend its way up his snow-covered drive, bringing with it a proposition that would make saving this dog's life seem like the simple part of his week. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having spent itself sometime in the night. John had just finished his morning coffee when he heard it, the unfamiliar sound of a powerful engine laboring up his drive. The dog, much stronger now, lifted her, head from her blanket by the fire, ears perked with sudden interest. Through his frost-etched window, John watched a vehicle unlike any he'd seen on his property before, a sleek black limousine looking absurdly out of place against the snow-covered Wyoming landscape. The car moved with careful precision along, his ploughed drive, its pristine surface reflecting the morning sun like polished obsidian. "Friends of yours?" John asked the dog. Her tail wagged once, and she rose shakily to her feet. Whatever weakness had plagued her last night seemed to be fading, replaced by an alert anticipation that made John even more curious about her origins. The limousine came to a stop, its tinted windows revealing nothing of its occupants. John stepped onto his porch, unconsciously straightening his worn flannel shirt. The rear door opened with practiced smoothness, and a woman emerged who seemed as out of place in rural Wyoming as her vehicle. She was small but carried herself with unmistakable authority, her tailored charcoal suit probably worth more than his monthly mortgage payment. Asian, maybe in her early 40s, with an elegance that spoke of old money and older traditions, but it was her eyes that caught John's attention, sharp, intelligent, and fixed on him, with an intensity that made him straighten his spine. "Mr. McKinnon." Her voice was clear and cultured, with just a hint of an accent he couldn't place. "I'm Victoria Chen. I believe you found something that belongs to me." As if on cue, the dog appeared in the doorway behind John. The transformation in the animal was immediate and remarkable. Despite her ordeal, she carried herself now with perfect posture, every movement precise and measured. This, John realized, was no ordinary pet. This was a highly trained working dog. "Aurora," Victoria said softly, and the dog's tail wagged once. But to John's surprise, she didn't rush to her owner. Instead, she stayed by his side, pressing gently against his leg. "She was half frozen when I found her," John said, his hand automatically dropping to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Lucky to be alive." "Yes." Victoria's gaze softened slightly. "Lucky you found her." She gestured to the limousine, where a man in a dark suit was removing a sleek leather briefcase. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside. The morning is rather brisk." John hesitated only a moment before nodding. His father had taught him to be wary of city folks bearing briefcases. They usually wanted something more valuable than money. But the dog's calm presence beside him suggested this woman, whatever her purpose, wasn't a threat. Inside, Victoria took in his modest living room with a careful glance that missed nothing. Her eyes lingered on the family photos, the worn furniture, the ancient rifle above the fireplace that his grandfather had carried across the prairie. John saw his home suddenly through her eyes, comfortable but shabby, lived in but dated. He felt a flash of defiance. This was a working ranch, not a showpiece. "Coffee?" he offered, remembering his manners. "Thank you, no." Victoria settled gracefully onto his old couch, seemingly unbothered by its worn state. The man with the briefcase remained standing by the door, as still as a statue. "Mr. McKinnon, I'll be direct. Aurora is more than just a pet to me. She's part of a very specialized breeding and training program worth millions in research and development." John looked down at the dog, Aurora, who had settled between them, her eyes moving back and forth as if following the conversation. "That explains a few things." "Indeed." Victoria's lips curved slightly. "Which is why I'm prepared to offer you $10 million as a reward for saving her life." The words hung in the air like smoke, seemingly impossible in the morning light of his familiar room. John's hand stilled on Aurora's head as the figure rolled around in his mind. $10 million, enough to save the ranch 10 times over, enough to secure his family's legacy for generations. "That's—" he started, then stopped, unsure how to even respond to such an offer. "A substantial sum, yes," Victoria finished for him. But believe me when I say Aurora is worth far more to my program. The reward is merely appropriate compensation for your timely intervention. The man by the door opened the briefcase, revealing neat stacks of documents. Everything is prepared, Victoria continued. The funds can be transferred immediately. We've taken the liberty of having the paperwork drawn up. John looked down at Aurora, who gazed back with those intelligent eyes. $10 million. The guy, solution to every problem currently weighing on his shoulders. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes the highest price you can pay for something is taking money for it. Ma'am, he said slowly, I appreciate the offer, but Victoria held up a hand, stopping him. Before you continue, Mr. McKinnon, there's something else you should know about Aurora and about why I'm really here. She reached into her suit jacket and withdrew a folded newspaper clipping, aged yellow with time. The image showed a younger Victoria standing beside a familiar building, one that made John's breath catch in his throat. It was his family's original ranch house, the one that had burned down in '82. 40 years ago, Victoria began, smoothing the clipping on his coffee table, a rancher named Thomas McKinnon found a little girl half frozen in a snowstorm. She was 8 years old, spoke barely any English, and had gotten separated from a Chinese tour group visiting Yellowstone. John stared at the photograph, memories stirring. He'd been just a boy then, but he remembered his father bringing home a shivering child wrapped in his coat. She'd stayed with them for 3 days while authorities located her family. That was you, he said softly. Victoria nodded, her composed expression softening slightly. Your father saved my life. He and your mother took care of me until my parents could arrive. It was my first experience of true American kindness, something I'd only read about in books. Aurora shifted closer to Victoria, resting her head on her knee. The gesture seemed to give her strength to continue. That experience changed me, changed how I saw this country, its people. When I started my company, I made a promise to myself that I would find a way to repay that debt. She gestured to the dog. Aurora is part of that promise. From her briefcase, she withdrew a thick file filled with technical diagrams and medical charts. She's not just a highly trained dog, Mr. McKinnon. She's part of a program we've developed using advanced AI and genetic engineering to create companion animals capable of detecting medical emergencies before they happen. John looked at Aurora with new understanding. The intelligence in those eyes wasn't just training, it was something more. Her collar contains sophisticated sensors that monitor environmental conditions and vital signs. She was actually part of a field test when the storm hit. Something in her programming drew her here, to this ranch. Victoria's voice held a note of wonder. Of all the places she could have sought shelter, you're saying it wasn't an accident, John said slowly. I'm saying that sometimes debts have a way of collecting themselves. Victoria straightened. The papers with precise movements. The $10 million isn't just a reward, Mr. McKinnon. It's an investment. You see, I want to use part of your ranch as a training facility for our program. These dogs need space, isolation, and most importantly, people who understand both animals and the value of compassion. John sat back, his mind spinning. The technical documents before him might as well have been written in Chinese, for all he could understand them. But Aurora's presence was proof enough of their meaning. The dog's eyes met his, and he could have sworn she nodded slightly. There are other sites we could use, Victoria continued, but none with this history, none with this connection. She stood, moving to the window to gaze out at the snow-covered pastures. 40 years ago, your father took in a lost little girl and showed her that kindness transcends language, culture, and circumstance. Now his son has done the same for one of our most valuable prototypes. She turned back to face him, and for a moment John saw past the polished exterior to the grateful child his father had once saved. The money is yours either way, a debt repaid. But the opportunity to be part of this program, that's something else entirely. Aurora moved to stand between them, her tail wagging slowly as she looked from one to the other. In the morning light, her fur had regained its golden luster, and there was nothing left of the dying animal John had found in the snow. She was magnificent, a glimpse of the future wrapped in the familiar form of man's oldest friend. The weight of the moment pressed down on John like a physical thing. His father's journal sat on the shelf behind him, filled with wisdom about debts, promises, and doing what was right. But nothing in it could have prepared him for this moment. "I believe," Victoria said softly, "that your father would have appreciated the symmetry of this situation." John looked around his living room, at the photographs of 3 generations of McKinnons, at the worn furniture that held decades of memories, at the morning sun painting everything in shades of possibility. Then he looked at Aurora, who had proven that miracles could still happen, even in the depths of winter. John stood at his kitchen window, watching Victoria's team unloading equipment from a second vehicle that had arrived shortly after their conversation. His mortgage papers lay spread across the table behind him, the red "past due" stamps stark against the white paper. Aurora sat quietly at his feet, her presence somehow both comforting and complicating. $10 million, he muttered, still unable to wrap his mind around the figure. The dog's tail thumped against the floor once, like punctuation. Before giving his answer to Victoria, he'd asked for an hour to think. She'd graciously agreed, stepping outside to make some calls. Now time was ticking down, and his thoughts kept circling back to his father's words about debts and promises. The bank papers told one story, a story of struggling commodity prices, rising costs, and the slow death of family ranching in the modern world. But his heart told another. This land wasn't just property. It was his heritage, his identity. The idea of turning any part of it into a high-tech dog training facility felt like a betrayal of everything the McKinnons had built. Yet there was Aurora, living proof that the future didn't have to erase the past. The dog moved to the window beside him, watching the activity outside with keen interest. One of the technicians waved, and Aurora's tail wagged in response, a perfect blend of natural instinct and advanced programming. His phone buzzed, a text from his nearest neighbor, old Bill Henderson. "Saw the fancy cars headed your way. Everything okay?" John stared at the message, realizing how quickly word would spread. In ranching country, privacy was as scarce as rain in August. The community had always been suspicious of outside investors, seeing them as vultures circling dying ranches. But this felt different. Victoria wasn't trying to buy him out. She wanted to add something new while preserving what was already here. And there was the debt she felt she owed, a debt paid forward through generations. Aurora nudged his hand, drawing his attention to Victoria, who was walking back toward the house. Even at a distance, her urban sophistication stood out against the rugged landscape. Yet there was something in her determined stride that reminded him of his mother, another strong woman who had adapted to ranch life on her own terms. The dog's collar sat on his coffee table, diamonds catching the morning light. Such an improbable thing to find out here, like Victoria herself. But improbable didn't mean impossible, as Aurora's very existence proved. John picked up his father's journal one more time, turning to the last entry his father had written. "The land endures, but it doesn't have to endure unchanged. Each generation must find its own way to be worthy of its inheritance." A knock at the door announced Victoria's return. John straightened his shoulders, decision finally crystallizing in his mind. Aurora moved to sit between them as Victoria entered, her posture alert but relaxed, as if she already knew what he was going to say. "Ma'am," John began, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice, "I've been thinking about what my father would do." The Sunday edition of the Sweetwater County Gazette lay on nearly every kitchen table in the area. "Local ranch partners with tech giant," read the headline, accompanied by a photo of John standing beside Victoria Chen, with Aurora sitting perfectly, poised between them. The story had spread faster than a prairie fire, and with it came the kind of attention John had spent his whole life avoiding. "It's not a sale," he found himself explaining for the 10th time that morning, this time to Martha Wilson at the feed store. "The ranch stays exactly as it is. We're just adding something new." But he could see the doubt in her eyes, the same look he'd been getting all week. The bell above the store's door chimed, and Bill Henderson walked in, snow dusting his weathered Stetson. The old rancher had known John's father, had watched John grow up. His opinion carried weight in these parts. "Heard you're going into the dog business," Bill said, his voice carefully neutral. The store went quiet, other customers pretending not to listen while straining to hear every word. "Research facility," John corrected, meeting his neighbor's gaze. "For medical assistance dogs, like the one I found in the storm." He hesitated, then added, "Would mean some jobs for local folks, good ones." Bill studied him for a long moment. "Your daddy was always talking about diversifying. Course he meant maybe adding some sheep." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Reckon he never thought about robot dogs." "They're not robots," John said, realizing as he said it how defensive he sounded. "They're more like partners. You should see Aurora work. She's something else." As if summoned by her name, Aurora trotted into the store, having waited patiently. In John's truck, the change in atmosphere was immediate. The dog carried herself with a dignity that commanded attention, her intelligence evident in every measured movement. Martha Wilson, who'd been so skeptical moments before, couldn't help but reach out as Aurora passed. The dog paused, gently, accepting the pat before moving to sit beside John. There was something about her presence that made the technological future Victoria had described seem less alien, more approachable. "She found her way to the ranch in that storm," John explained, "out of all the places she could have gone. Like she knew." He didn't mention Victoria's history with his family. Some stories weren't his to tell. Bill Henderson knelt down, his wrench's hands gentle as he examined Aurora's build. "Fine animal," he admitted. "Reminds me of them search and rescue dogs, but different somehow." "That's because she is different," came a new voice. Victoria Chen stood in the doorway, looking oddly at home, despite her elegant city clothes. She represents a new chapter in the relationship between humans and animals, one that honors the traditional bond while embracing new possibilities. The store's customers shifted, uncertain how to react to this unexpected intrusion of the outside world into their familiar space. But Victoria moved among them with genuine warmth, answering questions, listening to concerns. She had a way of making her vision sound less like a corporate takeover and more like a natural evolution. "The McKinnon ranch will remain a working ranch," she assured them. "We chose it precisely because of its heritage, its connection to the land. What we're adding will enhance, not replace." By the time she finished speaking, even Martha Wilson was nodding thoughtfully. The tension in the room had shifted to something closer to curiosity. Aurora moved between the gathered people, her presence a bridge between the world they knew and the one that was coming. Outside, through the store's front window, John could see reporters from larger papers setting up cameras. The story was growing beyond their small community. But for now, in this familiar space with its smell of leather and hay, the future didn't seem quite so daunting. Bill Henderson cleared his throat. "Well, John," he said, "your father always said a ranch had to change to stay the same. Reckon this isn't what he had in mind, but—" He extended his hand. "If you say it's right, that's good enough for me." The words carried the weight of permission, of acceptance. Around the store, heads nodded. It wasn't universal approval. Not yet, but it was a start. As John shook his neighbor's hand, Aurora's tail wagged once, as if signaling her own approval of this small but significant moment. While sorting through old papers in his father's study, John discovered a box he'd never seen before. It was tucked behind decades of tax records, a simple wooden container with Chinese characters carved into its lid. His hands hesitated over it, some part of him already knowing this would change everything again. Inside lay a collection of letters, photographs, and a small red envelope that looked decades old. The first photograph showed his father, much younger, standing with a Chinese family in front of the old ranch house. The little girl from Victoria's newspaper clipping was there, but there was something else, something that made John's breath catch. Behind them, barely visible on the wall, hung a familiar shape. A butterfly crafted in jade, identical to the one Victoria wore on a chain around her neck. Aurora, who had been dozing by the window, suddenly sat up, her attention fixed on the box. John had learned to trust her reactions over the past week. "What is it, girl? What do you see?" The dog padded over, nose twitching at the scent of old. "Paper." She gently nudged a particular envelope free from the stack. Inside, John found a letter written in his father's distinctive hand, dated just months before his death. "My dear Victoria," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you've finally found your way back to the ranch. I always knew you would." John's hands trembled slightly as he read. The truth spilled out across pages of his father's careful writing. The Chinese family hadn't just stayed for 3 days. They'd returned every summer for years, becoming part of the extended ranch. Family. The jade butterfly had been a gift from Victoria's grandmother, a symbol of transformation and return. But there was more. Victoria's father, an early pioneer in artificial intelligence, had spent those summers discussing the future with John's father. They had shared a vision, using technology not to replace traditional ways of life, but to preserve them. The ranch was meant to be part of that vision all along. "Your father and I knew that ranching would have to evolve," Victoria's voice came from the doorway, making John start. She stood there with another box, this one sleek and modern. "We spent years planning this. The AI program that guides dogs like Aurora? It's built on principles your father helped develop, watching how ranchers work with their animals." John looked at Aurora, seeing her in a new light. That's why she came here in the storm. She wasn't just following programming, she was following a path laid down years ago. Victoria moved into the room. Her usual corporate poise softened. "By memory, the jade butterfly was a promise. My grandmother said that just as the butterfly returns to the same gardens, true connections always find their way home." She touched the pendant at her throat. "When I started the companion animal program, this was always its destination." Aurora moved between them, nudging another photograph free. This one showed a teenage Victoria helping with a cattle drive. Her city clothes replaced by practical ranch wear, her face bright with joy. John remembered taking that picture himself, though he'd been too young then to understand its significance. "Why didn't you tell me all this from the beginning?" he asked. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the answer. "Would you have believed me?" Victoria smiled slightly. "Would you have trusted that this wasn't just another corporate takeover, but the fulfillment of a plan our fathers made together? I needed you to make your own choice, just as I made mine." She opened the modern box she'd brought, revealing a set of advanced sensors, similar to the ones in Aurora's collar. But these were different, designed to work with regular ranch dogs, to help them protect cattle in ways that would preserve both the animals and the ranching way of life. "The future isn't about replacing the old with the new," Victoria said softly. "It's about helping them transform together, like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis while keeping the essence of what it always was." Aurora sat between them, her presence a living bridge between past and future. Outside, the evening sun caught the jade butterfly on Victoria's neck, casting small green shadows that danced like memories across the study walls. In that moment, John understood that some inheritances were more than just land and buildings. They were dreams passed down, waiting for the right time to take flight. That night, John sat alone in his father's study, the family Bible open on his lap. Inside its well-worn cover, generations of McKinnons had recorded their histories, births, deaths, marriages, and the major decisions that had shaped the ranch's destiny. His father's handwriting filled the most recent pages, including an entry John had never noticed before, dated just weeks before his death. Some will say we're betraying the old ways, the entry read. But the first McKinnon to work this land wasn't afraid to try new things. He knew that tradition isn't about staying the same. It's about keeping what matters while finding new ways to make it work. Aurora lay at his feet, her head resting on his boot. Since the discoveries of the afternoon, she seemed even more attuned to his mood, as if the revelation of her true purpose had strengthened their connection. "What would you do?" he asked the dog, not really expecting an answer. But Aurora lifted, her head, her eyes holding that uncanny intelligence that still surprised him. She rose and walked to his father's desk, nosing at the drawer where they'd found the box of letters. John followed, pulling out the correspondence again. This time, he noticed something he'd missed before, a small notebook wedged at the bottom. Inside, in his father's precise hand, were detailed notes about combining traditional ranching methods with emerging technology, pages of observations about how dogs worked with cattle, theories about animal behavior, and rough sketches that looked remarkably similar to Aurora's training protocols. "He never gave up on the dream," Victoria had said before leaving. "Even when my family moved back to China, even when other opportunities arose, he kept working on it. He believed that this ranch could be more than just a piece of history. It could be a bridge to the future." The Bible's pages rustled in the evening breeze from the open window. John's eye caught another entry, this one from his grandfather's time. "Bought our first tractor today. Some neighbors say it's not real ranching anymore. But I watch my son learning to repair it, seeing how it can help us do more with less. And I know we're on the right path." Every generation had faced its moment of change, his grandfather with machinery, his father with modern veterinary practices, and now John looked at Aurora, who represented a leap forward he could barely comprehend. Yet here she was, as solid and real as any working dog he'd ever known, just with capabilities that would have seemed like magic to his ancestors. The community's reactions played through his mind. Bill Henderson's cautious acceptance, Martha Wilson's gradual warming to the idea, the younger ranchers' barely concealed excitement about the job prospects. Change was coming to their valley one way or another. The question was whether it would sweep away the old ways entirely, or whether someone would find a path to preserve what mattered most. John closed the Bible carefully, running his hand over its worn leather cover. Inside, blank pages waited for his own entry, his own choice. Aurora pressed against his leg, offering silent support. "Dad knew," he said softly. "He knew this day would come, knew we'd need to find a new way forward." The dog's tail thumped against the floor, once, twice. But he also knew it had to be. "My choice." Standing, John moved to the window. The setting sun painted the ranch in shades of gold, just as it had for 3 generations of McKinnons. The old barn still stood strong, the corrals still held cattle, the land still stretched away toward the mountains. Nothing about Victoria's proposal would change those essentials. If anything, her program might help ensure they continued for generations to come. He thought of his father and Victoria's father, 2 men from different worlds, sharing a vision of the future on long summer evenings. They had seen something he was only now beginning to understand, that preservation, sometimes, required transformation. Aurora brought him his phone, another display of her remarkable training. The screen showed Victoria's message from earlier. "Take all the time you need. Some choices shouldn't be rushed." But John was done waiting. In his heart, he knew what his father would say. The same thing he'd said when they bought their first computer, installed their first solar panels, adopted their first modern farming techniques. "The ranch endures by growing, son, not by standing still." The conference room at the Sweetwater Bank had never seen a presentation quite like this one. Victoria stood before a holographic display that transformed the staid space into something from the next century. 3-dimensional renderings of the proposed facility floated in the air, while Aurora demonstrated her abilities for the astonished bank officers. "The McKinnon Ranch," Victoria explained, manipulating the display with practiced gestures, will become more than a training facility. It will be a living laboratory where traditional ranching knowledge meets cutting-edge technology. John watched the bankers' faces shift from skepticism to intrigue as Victoria laid out her vision. The initial 10 million would be just the beginning. The partnership would include ongoing funding, profit sharing from the program's developments, and most importantly, a guarantee that the ranch would continue its traditional operations alongside the new facility. Think of it as two complementary businesses, Victoria continued, bringing up a new set of projections. The ranch continues its cattle operation, enhanced by our technology. Meanwhile, the training facility develops and refines the next generation of assistance animals, benefiting from the authentic working environment the ranch provides. Aurora moved through the room, demonstrating her ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed, bringing water to a banker who had merely touched his throat, alerting them to a phone about to ring seconds before it did. The dog's performance made Victoria's proposals seem less like science fiction and more like an inevitable future. The facility will be largely underground, Victoria added, zooming in on the architectural plans. Minimal surface impact, maximum preservation of the ranch's traditional character. We'll use existing grazing patterns to help train the dogs in real-world conditions. John stepped forward, adding his own perspective. This isn't about replacing ranch work with machines. It's about using technology to preserve our way of life. These dogs could help us reduce cattle losses, manage the land more efficiently, even predict weather patterns that might threaten the herd. The bank president, Tom Wheeler, who had known 3 generations of McKinnons, studied the proposals carefully. This is substantial, he admitted. But what about the community impact? We've seen too many traditional operations swallowed up by outside interests. Victoria smiled, pressing a button that transformed the display. That's where this comes. We're proposing a training program in partnership with the local community college. Ranch kids who want to stay in the area will have opportunities to learn both traditional skills and cutting-edge technology, the best of both worlds. The numbers spoke for themselves. Hundreds of new jobs, increased tax revenue for the county, educational opportunities that would keep young people from leaving for the cities. But it was the underlying philosophy that seemed to resonate most. The idea that progress didn't have to mean erasure. We're not just preserving buildings and boundaries, Victoria concluded, her hand unconsciously touching the jade butterfly at her throat. We're preserving a way of life by helping it evolve. The McKinnon Ranch won't just survive, it will help shape the future of ranching itself. Aurora, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, moved to sit precisely between John and Victoria. Her presence embodied everything they were discussing: tradition and innovation, nature and technology, past and future in perfect balance. The bank president closed his folder slowly, thoughtfully. John, your father used to talk about finding new ways to keep the old ways alive. I didn't understand what he meant until now. He extended his hand first to John, then to Victoria. I think we'd be very interested in helping finance any additional infrastructure this project might need. As they shook hands, John felt the weight of generations lifting. Through the bank's windows, he could see the mountains that had witnessed every change this valley had endured. They stood unchanged, eternal, just as the essential spirit of ranching would endure, even as its forms evolved. Victoria's final words to the bankers summed it up perfectly. The best traditions don't survive by remaining static. They survive by remaining relevant. That's what we're offering here. A way to keep the heart of ranching beating strong in an age of unprecedented change. The architect's plans lay spread across John's kitchen table, held down by coffee cups and the weight of Aurora's watchful presence. Through the window, construction crews were already at work, their machines choreographing a careful dance around the ranch's daily operations. Victoria had been true to her word. The new facility was emerging with minimal disruption to the existing ranch work. "We'll have the first training spaces ready within a month," Sarah Chen, Victoria's head of operations, explained. Unlike her cousin, Sarah wore practical ranch clothes and spoke with a Wyoming accent that betrayed her university years in Laramie. "The underground complex will take longer, but the temporary buildings will let us start the pilot program on schedule." John nodded, watching as Aurora moved to the window to observe a group of local ranch hands receiving training on the new monitoring equipment. The dog's capabilities had proven invaluable in helping bridge the gap between the old ways and the new technology. "How are the traditional dogs handling the integration?" he asked, thinking of his own working dogs who had initially been wary of Aurora's presence. Sarah smiled. "Better than expected. We're finding that Aurora actually helps train them. She demonstrates the behaviors we want, and they naturally follow her lead. It's like she speaks both languages, dog and digital." Outside, a young rancher's daughter was fitting a standard cattle dog with one of the new sensor collars, her father watching with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. The girl's ease with both the animal and the technology seemed to symbolize everything the project was trying to achieve. "The community college program is already oversubscribed," Sarah continued, pulling up data on her tablet. "We've had inquiries from 3 neighboring counties. Turns out there are a lot of young people who want to stay in ranching if they can see a future in it." John thought about his father's journal entries, his vision of a ranch that could change without losing its soul. The past week had brought a steady stream of visitors, curious neighbors, interested investors, even a few old-timers who'd initially opposed the project, but now wanted to see for themselves what was happening. Aurora suddenly perked up, moving to the door seconds before a knock announced Victoria's arrival. She entered carrying a thick folder of new contracts and proposals. "The Japanese delegation just confirmed," she announced, her business attire now accessorized with practical boots that showed traces of ranch dust. "They're interested in adapting the program for their agricultural regions, and the Australian Ranchers Cooperative wants to discuss a partnership." The scope of what they were creating was starting to sink in. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, saving a dog from a snowstorm, was evolving into something that could transform ranching worldwide. "We've also had some unexpected results," Sarah added, pulling up footage from the previous day's cattle work. The screen showed Aurora working alongside traditional ranch dogs, her advanced sensors helping predict and prevent a stampede before it could begin. "The AI is learning from the traditional dogs as much as they're learning from her. It's creating a whole new methodology." John watched the footage, remembering his father's words about tradition and progress. On screen, the seamless cooperation between high-tech and traditional working dogs proved that the two worlds could do more than just coexist. They could enhance each other. A commotion outside drew their attention. One of the regular ranch dogs had apparently decided to follow Aurora's example, alerting handlers to a heifer in early labor well before visible signs appeared. The dog had no smart collar, no AI enhancement. It had simply learned from watching Aurora work. "That's not supposed to be possible," Victoria said softly, watching through the window. "We thought the advanced capabilities could only come from our technology, but somehow they're adapting," John finished. "Just like we are." Aurora sat between them, her tail wagging slowly as they watched the traditional dog receive praise and treats for its innovative behavior. Outside, old and new continued to merge. Ranch hands checking tablets while sitting horseback, smart sensors being fitted alongside traditional tack. Young people learning AI programming in the same space where their parents had learned to rope. In cattle, the transition wasn't perfect. There were still skeptics, still problems to solve. But standing there in his kitchen, watching the future unfold against the backdrop of his family's legacy, John felt a deep certainty that they were on the right path. The emergency weather alert came at 3 a.m. its harsh buzz jolting John awake. Aurora was already at his bedside, her posture tense with alertness. The National Weather Service warning on his phone confirmed what the dog had somehow sensed coming. A massive storm system was bearing down on the valley, bringing with it the deadly combination of heavy snow and plunging temperatures. But this wasn't just any storm. The AI-enhanced weather monitoring system Victoria had installed was showing patterns that made John's blood run cold. Two fronts colliding directly over the ranch, creating conditions eerily similar to the blizzard of '97 that had killed hundreds of cattle across the county. "How many head out in the north pasture?" Victoria's voice crackled over the emergency radio system. She'd been in Denver for meetings, but was already heading back. "About 300, John replied, pulling on his boots, including most of the pregnant heifers. The timing couldn't have been worse. They were right in the middle of calving season. Aurora paced by the door, her collar's sensors feeding data to the ranch's new command center. The technology was indicating that they had maybe 2 hours before the storm hit. But John's old rancher's instincts, honed by decades of reading Wyoming weather, told him they had less. Outside, the ranch was coming alive with urgent activity. Traditional ranch hands and tech team members moved with unified purpose, years of cattle handling experience merging with cutting-edge crisis management protocols. Young calves were already being moved to the new climate-controlled barn, their mothers following, while wearing both traditional markers and smart tracking collars. The AI prediction models are conflicting with standard meteorological data, Sarah reported, her voice tight with concern. One says go north to avoid the worst of it. The other says that's exactly where the storm cell will hit hardest. John looked at Aurora, who had been unusually agitated since midnight. The dog's advanced sensors were picking up atmospheric changes that even the weather stations might have missed. Her gaze was fixed firmly toward the south. "Trust the dog," John decided. It was the kind of intuitive call his father would have made, but now backed by technology even he couldn't have imagined. "Get everyone moving toward the South Valley." The next hour was a blur of coordinated chaos. Horses and ATVs moved together through the pre-dawn darkness, their riders guided by a combination of traditional skill and augmented reality displays showing the safest routes. Aurora worked alongside the regular ranch dogs, their combined abilities creating a seamless net around the frightened cattle. The pregnant heifers were the biggest concern. 2 were already showing signs of early labor, stressed by the rapidly changing atmospheric pressure. The new mobile veterinary unit, equipped with both traditional tools and advanced monitoring equipment, kept pace with the herd. "Temperature dropping fast," called Bill Henderson over the radio. The old rancher had initially been skeptical of all the new technology, but now he monitored the digital displays with the same attention he gave to the sky and wind. Barometers going crazy. John felt the change coming before either human or machine could announce it. A deadly stillness in the air, the kind that preceded nature's worst moments. Aurora suddenly stopped, her ears forward, body rigid with attention. Through the swirling darkness, John could see the massive wall of the storm front approaching. But something was wrong. The south route that had seemed so promising was about to become a death trap. The storm had split, its 2 fronts now converging to create a funnel effect that would trap them in the valley. They were caught between technology and tradition, between the new way and the old, with 300 lives hanging in the balance. And in that moment, John McKinnon had to make a decision that would either validate or destroy everything they'd been working toward. Aurora's eyes met his, centuries of ranching wisdom meeting the cutting edge of artificial intelligence. The dog's collar blinked with urgent data, while her instincts spoke of more ancient knowledge. In that moment, John realized that the solution wouldn't come from choosing between the old way and the new. It would come from finding a way to use both. "Split the herd!" John's voice carried over the howling wind and the ranch's communication system simultaneously. Old Quarry Cave System, Southeast Ridge. Dad used it in '97. The command center's screens flickered with urgent red warnings. The AI models couldn't account for this option because the caves weren't in their database, but Aurora was already moving, leading the way with unwavering certainty, her advanced sensors now working in concert with pure animal instinct. Victoria's voice crackled through the radio. "John, the thermal imaging shows catastrophic temperature drops ahead. We can't calculate a safe route through." "Sometimes you can't calculate," John cut in, memories of his father's teachings flooding back. "Sometimes you have to know." He switched channels. "Bill, remember that summer we spent exploring those caves? The high passage that connects to the upper meadow?" "South Fork," Bill confirmed immediately. "Natural windbreak opens to the lee side. Your daddy used to say it was God's own shelter in a storm." There was a pause. "But getting there, Aurora can lead them." John watched as the dog already began gathering the regular ranch dogs, organizing them with a precision that merged learned behavior with programmed response. "Sarah, get me a drone view of the ridge approach. There's a trail, but it'll be nearly invisible in this weather." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in integrating old knowledge with new capabilities. Drone footage overlaid with thermal imaging helped identify the safest approach, while Aurora's sensors detected dangerous ice patches and unstable ground. The regular ranch dogs, following her lead, kept the herd moving in a tight, controlled pattern that John recognized from generations of cattle drives. Two of the pregnant heifers were struggling, but the mobile veterinary unit stayed with them, using both traditional techniques and advanced monitoring to keep them stable. The rest of the herd, sensing shelter ahead, followed with the kind of focused determination that had helped their species survive on these ranges for centuries. The cave entrance appeared through the swirling snow, exactly where John remembered it. Aurora paused at the threshold, her senses scanning for hazards, while her nose tested the air in a gesture as old as her species. Then she gave a single bark, all clear. "Temperature stabilizing inside the cave system," Sarah reported, reading data from Aurora's collar. "Natural geothermal effects, just like the old-timers always claimed. The AI is already updating its models based on this data." The herd moved in with practiced efficiency, guided by dogs and humans working in seamless cooperation. Traditional ranch hands directed traffic, while tech team members monitored vital signs and environmental conditions. Inside, the natural cave structure created a series of chambers that sheltered the cattle in groups, just as they had during countless storms before. "Got a heifer going into active labor," called the vet tech. "But we're in the best possible place for it. These caves maintain a constant temperature, and the new equipment works fine down here." John watched as Aurora organized the other dogs to keep the herd calm during the birth. The dogs' advanced programming included midwifery protocols, but she was also displaying the kind of intuitive understanding that had made dogs invaluable to ranchers for generations. Victoria arrived just as the first calf was born, having driven through the storm to reach them. She stood with John at the cave entrance, watching technology and tradition blend seamlessly in the scene before them. "You knew about these caves." "All along," she said. "It wasn't a question. Why didn't you tell us? We could have included them in the emergency protocols." "Some things you have to discover when you need them," John replied, remembering his father's words. "Sometimes the old ways work best when they're learned, not just programmed." Aurora approached them, her coat dusted with snow but her bearing proud. The data from her collar was already being uploaded to the main system, adding this traditional shelter to the AI's knowledge base. Future generations would have access to both the technology and the wisdom that had saved the herd today. "Besides," John added, watching as another calf was born into this strange mix of past and future, "isn't that what this whole project is about? Learning from each other?" The storm raged outside, but inside the ancient caves, warmed by geothermal, Heat and monitored by cutting-edge technology, 300 cattle and one remarkable dog had proved that the future didn't have to choose between old and new. It just had to be smart enough to use both. The morning after the storm, John stood at the mouth of the cave system, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and rose. Behind him, the soft lowing of cattle and quiet beeping of monitoring equipment created an oddly harmonious symphony. Not a single animal had been lost, a miracle by traditional standards and a technological triumph by modern ones. Letters and emails were already pouring in from ranchers across the region. Word of how the McKinnon ranch had combined old wisdom with new technology to save their herd had spread faster than the storm itself. The cave rescue would become a case study in both traditional ranch management and advanced emergency response. The AI teams are calling it a breakthrough in adaptive learning, Sarah explained, showing John the overnight data analysis. Aurora's behavior during the crisis has completely transformed our understanding of how natural instincts can enhance artificial intelligence. The dog in question lay nearby, accepting gentle pats from Bill Henderson, who had spent the night helping tend to the newborn calves. The old rancher's initial skepticism had given way to a kind of wondering respect. "Your daddy would have loved this," Bill said, scratching behind Aurora's ears. "He always said the best solutions came from keeping an open mind while remembering the old ways." He gestured to where traditional ranch hands and tech specialists were working together to process the gathered data. "Reckon this is what he meant." Victoria arrived with a stack of thank you notes from the community. Local families had been following the crisis through social media updates, and their responses reflected a shifting perspective. What had once been seen as a threat to traditional ranching was now being recognized as its potential salvation. "The community college wants to expand the training program," she reported. "We've had 40 new applications just this morning. Young people who say they never considered staying in ranching until they saw what happened here." One of the tech team members approached with a tablet showing footage from the rescue. The cameras had captured something remarkable: the moment when Aurora had integrated her programmed responses with instinctive behavior, creating a new protocol that neither human nor machine could have devised alone. "It's like she built a bridge," the young technician said, his eyes bright with excitement, "between what she knows from her programming and what she understands as a dog. We're already updating the entire system based on what we learned last night." John walked through the cave system one last time before they began moving the herd back to the ranch. Every chamber held a story: new calves born during the storm, their vital signs monitored by advanced equipment, while traditional ranch hands provided the kind of care that technology couldn't replicate. Each space represented a perfect fusion of past and future. The last thank you note in the stack caught his attention. It was from Martha Wilson's granddaughter, a teenager who had always sworn she'd leave ranch life behind first chance she got. "After watching what happened at the McKinnon Ranch," she wrote, "I finally see how I can be part of both worlds. Maybe there's a future here after all." Aurora led the way as they began the careful process of moving the herd home. The regular ranch dogs worked seamlessly with her now, having learned to trust both her advanced capabilities and her basic animal instincts. Together, they represented everything the project had hoped to achieve: a perfect balance of tradition and progress. As the procession made its way back to the ranch, John noticed something that brought a smile to his face. The tracks in the snow told the story. Hoof prints and paw prints, boot prints and tire tracks, all moving forward together, creating a path that future generations could follow. 1 week after the storm, the McKinnon Ranch hosted a gathering unlike any in its history. The old barn had been transformed, hay bales serving as seating while advanced holographic displays showed footage from the cave rescue. Ranchers sat shoulder to shoulder with tech executives, their shared excitement bridging the cultural gap that had once seemed insurmountable. John and Victoria stood before the assembled crowd, a leather-bound partnership agreement on the podium between them. Aurora sat perfectly positioned at their feet, embodying the bridge between tradition and innovation that the document represented. What we saw during the storm wasn't just a successful rescue, Victoria began, her usual corporate polish softened by genuine emotion. It was proof that we don't have to choose between preserving the past and embracing the future. We can do both. The agreement's terms reflected this philosophy. The McKinnon Ranch would remain a working cattle operation, its traditional practices enhanced rather than replaced by technology. The new training facility would be integrated into existing structures where possible, with minimal impact on the landscape. But this is more than just a business arrangement, John added, looking out at the faces of neighbors he'd known all his life. This is about ensuring that ranching has a future in this valley, a future that our children might actually want to be part of. As if to emphasize his point, a group of local teenagers demonstrated the latest integration of traditional ranch skills with technological tools. They moved easily between horseback cattle work and drone operation, their natural affinity for both worlds drawing appreciative murmurs from the crowd. The final terms of the agreement had been shaped by lessons learned during the crisis. Aurora's unprecedented performance had shown that the most effective solutions came from combining the best of both worlds. The contract included provisions for documenting and preserving traditional ranching knowledge, integrating it with artificial intelligence in ways that would benefit both. The McKinnon Ranch will serve as a living laboratory, Victoria explained, bringing up detailed plans on the holographic display, a place where cutting-edge technology learns from generations of ranching wisdom and where traditional practices are enhanced, not replaced, by innovation. Bill Henderson stood up, his weathered face serious. Some of us weren't too sure about all this at first, he admitted. Thought it might be the end of real ranching. But after what we saw in that storm, he looked at Aurora, then at the young people eagerly absorbing both old skills and new. Well, maybe it's just the beginning. The partnership agreement included funding for a scholarship program, ensuring that local young people would have opportunities to learn both traditional ranching and the technical skills needed for the future. The community college's expanded program would be headquartered right on the ranch, allowing students to experience both worlds firsthand. As John signed his name beside Victoria's on the document, he felt the weight of generations watching. His father's journal sat on the podium, open to that prescient entry about finding new ways to keep the old ways alive. Beside it lay the architectural plans for the expanded facility, their careful design showing how the new could honor and preserve the old. Aurora's collar blinked as it recorded the historic moment, adding it to the growing database of ranch knowledge that would help guide future generations. But it was her tail, wagging with simple canine joy, that best expressed the spirit of the occasion, the perfect balance of sophistication and simplicity. The ceremony concluded with a celebration that blended old and new. Traditional ranch barbecue was served alongside innovations from the tech company's culinary labs. Music from local country bands mixed with demonstrations of the latest agricultural technology. Throughout it all, Aurora moved among the guests, equally at home with weather-beaten ranchers and polished executives. As the sun set behind the mountains, John watched the next generation of ranchers gathering around the holographic displays, their eyes bright with possibilities. The future they were building might not look exactly like the past, but it would carry forward everything that really mattered: the connection to the land, the value of hard work, and the wisdom of knowing that the best traditions were those that could grow and adapt without losing their heart. By early summer, the changes at McKinnon Ranch had begun to take concrete form. The new sign at the entrance reflected the transformation. The traditional ranch logo now incorporated a subtle digital element, while still maintaining its rustic character. Like everything else about the project, it managed to honor the past while embracing the future. The morning roundup demonstrated how seamlessly the integration had occurred. Riders on horseback worked in coordination with drone operators, their movements choreographed by a combination of traditional skill and technological precision. Aurora led a team of working dogs, their standard collars now equipped with scaled-down versions of her advanced sensors. "It's like they've always worked this way," Sarah remarked to John, watching as young ranch hands moved easily between tablet computers and traditional tools. The dogs especially. They've adapted to the new protocols without losing any of their natural abilities. The training facility, now nearly complete, had been built largely underground as promised, its presence marked only by a series of elegant low buildings that echoed traditional ranch architecture. Inside, state-of-the-art laboratories and training spaces coexisted with traditional tack rooms and workshops. Victoria's vision of educational opportunity was already bearing fruit. The community college program had attracted students from across the country, many of them children of ranchers looking for ways to preserve their family legacies. They learned AI programming alongside cattle handling, drone operation alongside horseback riding. "We've had to start a waiting list," the program director reported during the morning meeting. "And it's not just local kids anymore. We've got applications from Australia, Argentina, even Mongolia. They all want to learn what we're calling the McKinnon method now." The method in question had evolved naturally from the crisis during the storm. It was an approach that refused to choose between old and new, instead finding ways to let each strengthen the other. Traditional ranching knowledge was being documented and digitized, while new technology was being adapted to support time-tested practices. John watched from his office as a group of students gathered around Bill Henderson. The old rancher had become an unexpected bridge between generations, his deep knowledge of traditional methods now supplemented by a surprising enthusiasm for their technological enhancement. "See, the sensor data confirms what good ranchers have always known," Bill was explaining, holding up a tablet while pointing to a grazing herd. "Cattle behave differently before a storm. We used to just know it in our bones. Now we can prove it and predict it with even more accuracy." Aurora padded into the office, her presence drawing John's attention to the time. They had a video conference scheduled with ranchers in Brazil who were interested in implementing similar programs. The dog's role as ambassador for the project had grown beyond anyone's expectations, her unique capabilities helping to convince even the most traditional operators that change didn't have to mean loss. The meeting room reflected the ranch's new dual nature. Traditional Western art hung on the walls alongside interactive displays. The conference table was solid wood, handcrafted by a local artisan, but incorporated cutting-edge communication. Technology. Like everything else about the transformed McKinnon Ranch, it found elegance in the balance between old and new. As John prepared for the call, he caught sight of a young girl leading her horse past his window. She rode with the natural ease of someone born to ranch life, but a tablet was secured to her saddle and her traditional cowboy hat sported a small camera. She represented everything they'd hoped to achieve. A future where the next generation could stay true to their roots while embracing new opportunities. The afternoon brought a visit from Martha Wilson, who had once been among the project's strongest skeptics. She stood with John by the corrals, watching Aurora work with a new group of dogs in training. "You know what my granddaughter told me yesterday?" Martha said, smiling. "She said she's decided to stay on our ranch after all. Says there's more. A future in it than she thought." She gestured to the bustling activity around them, reckoned she might be right about that. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch. From this vantage point, John could see both the traditional cattle operation and the new training facility working together in a harmony that would have seemed impossible just months ago. The McKinnon Ranch was still very much a ranch. It had just become something more as well, something that could help ensure that ranching itself had a future. 1 year later, John stood in his father's study, now transformed into a comfortable blend of traditional ranch office and modern command center. He held a framed photograph taken just that morning. The latest graduating class from the ranch's training program posed in front of the barn, their faces bright with promise. Aurora sat front and center, the prototype collar she'd worn during the storm now displayed in a case of honor in the facility's museum. The photograph would join others on the study wall. 3 generations of McKinnons watching over this newest chapter in the ranch's history. But it was another photo that caught John's eye, one that Victoria had given him during her last visit. It showed his father and her father sitting on the old ranch porch 30 years ago, sharing their dream of a future that had finally come to pass. "Your dad would be proud," Bill Henderson said from the doorway. The old rancher now served as a senior advisor to the training program, his decades of experience helping shape the integration of new technology with traditional methods, not just of what you saved, but of what you built. Through the window, John could see the morning activities unfolding. A group of students practiced drone herding while mounted on horseback, their movements guided by Aurora's descendants, a new generation of AI-enhanced dogs that combined the best of natural instinct and technological innovation. The dogs wore simplified versions of Aurora's original collar, now manufactured right there on the ranch. The McKinnon method, as it had come to be known, had spread far beyond Wyoming. Ranches across the world were adopting the integrated approach that had proven so successful here. The cave rescue during the storm had become legendary, studied by both agricultural schools and tech companies as a perfect example of how traditional wisdom and modern innovation could work together. Victoria's company had kept its word. The ranch remained first and foremost a working cattle operation. The research and training facilities complemented rather than overshadowed the traditional ranching activities. Most importantly, they had found ways to preserve and pass on the generations of knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. As if summoned by his thoughts, Aurora appeared in the doorway. Though slowing down now, she still carried herself with the same dignity that had first impressed John in the storm. She had become more than just a proof of concept. She was a symbol of everything they had achieved, a bridge between past and future. The morning sun caught the jade butterfly, pendant that now hung beside his father's old ranch photo, Victoria's gift to commemorate the project's first anniversary. Like the ranch itself, it represented the beauty of transformation, the power of honoring the past while embracing change. John picked up his father's journal one last time, turning to the final page where he had made his own entry. A ranch isn't just land or cattle or buildings, it's a promise to the future, a bridge between what was and what could be. Sometimes the best way to keep a promise is to let it grow into something bigger than you ever imagined. Outside, the next generation of ranchers was already at work, carrying forward a tradition that had found new ways to endure. The McKinnon Ranch had become more than just a success story. It was a blueprint for the future, proof that the heart of ranching could beat strongly even in a changing world. Aurora's tail wagged once, a simple gesture that summed up everything they had achieved. Some things, after all, would never need upgrading, like the bond between humans and dogs, the love of the land, and the wisdom of knowing that the best traditions were those that had room to grow.